A restaurant with no waiters, where customers choose their dish from an array of coin-operated glass windows with zero human interaction. It sounds like a post-pandemic, socially reclusive fantasy, but it actually started way back on June the 12th, 1902, when business partners Joseph Horn and Frank Hardart blew Philadelphians' minds with the opening of their first vending machine restaurant. This is everything you need to know about the history of the Automat.
Yeah, and you say that there was no human interaction, but there was one, and it was when you first came in. It was optional, in actual fact, which was that you could go up to the female cashiers who sat behind a glass booth, and they sat there wearing these rubber tips on their fingers so that they could rifle through the money as quickly as possible. And then from there, you were left to your own devices. You then took your change and went to the vending windows around the shop, turned the knobs, and got out plates of whatever you wanted, meatloaf or mashed potatoes or cherry pie. There were hundreds of menu items that you could choose from. And then dining was this communal and kind of cafeteria style experience, which was meant to be a kind of corrective to the snobbery of so many of the other restaurants of the day.
And if all that sounds like a rather deep dive on one restaurant that opened in Philadelphia 120 years ago, the reason that we know all this is because the Automat very quickly expanded from this initial branch at 818 Chestnut Street, Philadelphia, to become, believe it or not, the biggest chain restaurant in the world. Albeit they were only in New York and Philadelphia, because this was in the years before McDonald's came along. But still, they served 800,000 people a day at their height, this chain of Horn and Hardart Automats. Once they'd come up with this template that people loved, they rolled it out across those two states. And it's weird because there's it seems to me, people who live in an Automat ignorant world and people who live in an Automat nostalgic world, and there's nothing in between.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it wasn't the first Automat in the world. This is where Horn and Hardart got the idea in the first place. They'd been running a successful cafe, like regular cafe with regular human staff chain in Philadelphia. But Hardart, he was born in Germany, and he was on a visit to Germany in 1900, having been kind of courted by a German salesman who had talked up a new technology in restaurants in Berlin. The first Automat had opened at Berlin Zoo in 1895 and had been an immediate novelty sensation. Hardart went, he visited, he loved what he saw, and so he came home, talked to Horn about it. They placed an order for this exciting new contraption, this wall of kind of vending machine, almost like drawers that you would open, like kind of like the lockers you get in a leisure centre, that sort of thing, but with glass windows.
I wonder if Horn was like, I'm just not sure this is going to work without the lions and the bats, though.
The contraption was made by a company called Cuisine for an eye-watering $30,000. This is in turn of the century money. But in case you hadn't already realised that the major flaw of the Automat restaurant was that it was born in the wrong era, they had to delay the opening of the Philadelphia inaugural restaurant because the steamship carrying the machine from Germany sank.
Nevertheless, on the first day, it was a huge success. The Automat in Philadelphia took 8,693 nickels, or $434, which translates to about $4,000 today. And that may not sound like very much, but the average fast food restaurant expects to make, in today's money, between $500 and $5,000 per day. So this is, even for the time, up around the top end of like what you would expect to make as a restaurateur.
And that's money from nickels as well, worth emphasising.
Right.
Everything cost a nickel. So it's like
Totally.
a pound shop in that sense, right? So it's amazing that they made those sorts of margins.
Well, everything was purchased with nickels at least, because like different menu items did have slightly different prices. I had a look at the menu from back in the day, and it does have a real mix of stuff, like a sliced chicken sandwich, a ham and lettuce sandwich. You've got like warm apple pie, glass of Coca-Cola. All of those were between like 60 cents and 10 cents for the Coke. But then there was a menu item that was deluxe roast prime ribs of beef with a jus, whipped potatoes, buttered fresh spinach, and roll and butter. That cost you $2.
Okay. That's not a nickel. Yeah, okay.
That's not a nickel. But also, it really expresses like the full range of stuff that you could purchase here.
Yeah, it's amazing to look at those menus and think, before McDonald's, fast food wasn't processed, and yet it was still popular and they were able to make it fast and in a way that children could access, just all the things that McDonald's did, a family restaurant, and yet actually a much more pleasant environment to be in, and food that was nutritionally not terrible for you.
Yeah, my favourite was from a 1958 menu from a Long Island branch. It included fried deep sea scallops. So I did ask myself, would I eat those from behind a lukewarm glass window? Kind of remains to be seen. But it's interesting because it was fast food, but it was also the opposite of fast food. Because instead of having smiling serving staff at the front and pre-packaged burgers being whipped up in the back, this was a faceless wall of machines in the front. But quite a traditional kitchen setup behind the scenes. The food was fresh. One thing they did that was very reminiscent of what fast food chains would later do is they had a gigantic book that they gave to all managers of the automats, where they had to learn exactly how everything had to be presented, so it would be an identical experience wherever you were in the country getting your automat food. It would look exactly the same, but it was a pretty traditional kitchen. Yeah, it was all made fresh. What happens when you took something out of one of those drawers? It would be refilled by these unseen hands in the kitchen. They'd sort of open up the back, slip the new item in, and you would never interact with them.
I think that textbook that they had, it was this hefty leather-bound rule book, in fact, that told employees how to prepare things in the proper Horn and Hardart way, is really key to the success of this whole enterprise, because it had stuff that really you can imagine being the foundation of lots of fast food restaurants today. They had things like do not slice bananas in advance as they discolor rapidly, cakes display in rush periods, make up no more than 6 orders at a time to avoid stale products, coffee first draw and throw away 2 ounces because coffee lying in the faucet absorbs a metallic flavor. All of these things that were designed to standardize, but also ensure at least a base level of quality. And I think that's why people came back, because even though you couldn't see what was going on behind the windows, you could be guaranteed that every sandwich or every apple pie you got out of this thing would have the same quality as it had yesterday.
And what a faucet, by the way. Can we just talk about the interiors of this restaurant? Because you used to get that coffee out of this sort of gold Rococo statue, I guess out of the mouth or something of like a cherubic boy, or there'd be like a gold tap on the wall. But it was all done in this really ornate, sort of Parisian bistro type vibe, the inside of the restaurant. It was an upmarket experience for very little money that everyone could access. And that came with marble counters and floors, stained glass, chrome fixtures, carved ceilings, this kind of Art Deco style out the front. And Howard Schultz, the CEO of Starbucks, has talked about how this concept influenced him because you could go in and just order whatever you wanted and no one asked you what you were going to have, and you could spend, 50 cents or you could spend $10. It was up to you. You chose your own experience. You were sitting in this very pleasant feeling room, and you might have just got yourself a coffee for a nickel and you could sit there all day. Or you might have brought 6 people for a 4-course meal and all of those people were sitting alongside each other, and that hadn't really been done before.
As you've probably realised at this point, this was very much budget dining, and it was a go-to option for legions of young professionals who were trying to get their start in big cities, who might not have the skills or even the facilities to cook for themselves in their dingy apartments. And in New York, particularly, getting dinner at the Automat was basically a meme for struggling artists. And so those who did eventually make it had a tendency to romanticize them, to romanticize that period of their lives, especially because with no judgy waiters, as we mentioned, you could buy a cup of their famous coffee and sit around for hours, which many of them did, when they didn't have any work. So people like Irving Berlin, who went on to become extremely famous, they've retained really fond memories of the Horn Hardart Automats.
But I think also the business of how they maintained this whole operation. Like, you could go in there and think that just the whole thing was being run by robots. But of course, there were employees who were working hard back there to deliver you your deep fried scallops or whatever it is. But the managers in these restaurants still had to have humans to cook and to bring the food to the vending machines and to wash the silverware and the dishes and all of that. But they got away with paying really below par wages and forcing employees to work overtime because you couldn't see them. And actually, in August of 1937, American unions picketed Horn and Hardarts across the city, protesting against unfair labour practices that were allowing people to have this incredibly cheap coffee experience in the first place.
Yes, and the low profit margins but the high turnover was based on the fact that it could be open all day and people potentially could go there for 3 or 4 meals a day. But that changed as the century went on. The things that had been the building blocks for their success slowly started ebbing away. There was more competition. There wasn't the opportunity to open at night because there weren't people there anymore in the evenings who wanted to come. And so the business slowly started struggling and couldn't adapt quickly enough to the onslaught of the modern fast food restaurant.
Yeah, and the idea that the Horn and Hardart style of dining had been displaced by fast food restaurants was spelt out very starkly, because most of the Horn and Hardart locations were ultimately converted into Burger Kings.
Well, I mean, the concept is still attractive, I think, to some people. I went to a food court last week called Arcade. Have you been there in Tottenham Court Road? Mm-mm. You open up an app to order whatever you want. You don't have to talk to anyone, and someone comes and delivers it to you, and you can have the burger from over there and the Vietnamese whatever from over there. And it's kind of swish and cool, but it's frictionless. But of course, it has to be like that now. It has to be on a sodding app, doesn't it? And I was sitting there thinking, I'm enjoying being in this environment, and I don't mind paying more than I would in a fast food joint. But at the same time,
but what am I going to do with these pockets full of nickels that you give me?
At the same time, I have to keep looking at my phone, and I look at my bloody phone all day long. I look at my phone at work. I want to go out. I want to stop looking at my phone. But I think it sort of has to be that now. And that's actually less appealing, isn't it, than this romance?
Put those people in a glass box and I'm interested.
Yeah.